one could possibly say that the story I'm reporting on today would never have come to be without this man, Robert Maxwell. He was Ghislaine's father, yes, but he was also the key to understanding how Jeffrey built his fortune. And he was the bond between his favorite daughter and Jeffrey. You may remember that he died in 1991 under very strange circumstances.
The publisher, Robert Maxwell, is missing at sea, feared lost overboard from his motor yacht. The yacht was cruising off the coast of Tenerife when the captain reported that Mr. Maxwell had disappeared.
And it was soon after that suspicious death that Jeffrey suddenly had enough money to buy a vast ranch in New Mexico, a mansion in New York, a private plane, and later an entire island. It was so much, so fast. Where did this money come from? There were many rumors. There are still well-placed skeptics who say that there is no record of the two men meeting. But I have other sources who say that Jeffrey Epstein and Robert Maxwell may well have known each other. One person says that he has direct knowledge that they did. Two others say that Jeffrey told them that they did. A fourth is Ed Epstein, no relation to Jeffrey. Ed is a journalist who I've known for many years.
Jeffrey knew Maxwell. He told one of his close friends that he knew Maxwell before he knew Ghislaine. So he bragged that he knew him. So we don't know anything about Jeffrey because Jeffrey would lie as well as tell the truth. But he did tell people that he knew Maxwell. And that even he claims, although I don't know it's at all true, Maxwell introduced him to his daughter.
So I went back to look at Robert Maxwell and any possible connections to Jeffrey that might have tied Jeffrey to Ghislaine, visibly and invisibly. I'm Vicky Ward, and this is Chasing Ghislaine. Robert Maxwell was tall, dark, and charismatic. In middle age, he became vastly overweight, but this didn't dampen his magnetism. Women, moguls, and obviously his family craved his attention. But Robert Maxwell also had a dark side.
Robert Maxwell was totally unscrupulous.
Martin Dillon co-authored the book Robert Maxwell, Super Spy.
He was narcissistic. He was very transactional.
Like his death, Maxwell's life was a mystery. He was a modern-day Renaissance man with fingers in so many pies it was hard to keep up. He was a tycoon and a media mogul, as well as a crook, with close ties to foreign intelligence agencies.
He was a man who had huge media interest, but also huge political relationships with the President of America, Israel, Germany, Russia, Britain, France, and everything. His business was to steal money.
Much of his success was built on graft and lies, especially in his final years when his debts topped $1 billion. Maxwell engaged in shady accounting practices. He shuffled around loans, he misled banks and creditors, he stole from his own companies, all in an effort to keep his struggling media empire afloat and to keep up appearances. In 1984, he bought a group of newspapers, including the tabloid The Daily Mirror. He'd later buy the New York Daily News, which would cement his place as a global media mogul. He'd also buy the language instruction company, Berlitz International. He was a man who liked to show off his money. He had a mansion in Oxford, a Gulfstream jet, a helicopter, a yacht that was over half the length of a football field. He named it the Lady Ghislaine. But despite all this, Robert Maxwell was never accepted by the British establishment. Some people even viewed Maxwell as a Russian intelligence asset, particularly because of the very first business that Maxwell had acquired, the Pergamon Press.
According to reports in 2 national newspapers, Pergamon Press is one of 45 companies listed as so-called friendly firms in a confidential report of the Soviet Communist Party.
Pergamon Press has never been formally accused of espionage. But according to 2 sources, it might well have given Maxwell a very good cover to pass cutting-edge information on to other governments. Through its publishing of scientific papers, Maxwell could easily find out about the technological innovations in foreign countries. Martin Dillon says that the Pergamon Press also gave Maxwell the opportunity to be in contact with heads of state in the former Eastern Bloc countries.
And he was, going to sort of the leaders of countries like in Bulgaria, to Todor Zhivkov, the despot there, and saying, I would love to sort of have your sort of autobiography published. I would love to have a big book, published about you because people should really know about you. He did the same with Ceausescu in Romania. He was going in and out of, Moscow and the KGB headquarters.
According to Tom Bauer, back in Britain, Maxwell was considered a shady businessman, but
he always got away. He'd always talked his way out and bamboozled and bulldozed the opposition and the authorities aside because he was so courageous, purposeful, ruthless, a gambler and all the rest of it.
In 1991, the Maxwells were at the peak of their influence. But then
the millionaire publisher Robert Maxwell has died, apparently after falling from his yacht during a cruise in the Canary Islands. Trading in his businesses, Maxwell Communications and Mirror Group newspapers has been suspended.
After he'd apparently fallen over the guardrail of the Lady Ghislaine in the middle of the night, Maxwell's death was ruled an accident. Most likely that he'd had a heart attack. But many people, even his own family, have subsequently suggested that Robert Maxwell was murdered. His widow, Betty, suggested foul play in her memoir, which was published 3 years after his death. She was quoted by the BBC as saying, "He's been murdered." Ghislaine also told her friend Christopher Mason that she was certain her father had been murdered.
There were reports in the papers, I think, because this allegation of him having been involved with the Israeli intelligence, and there were these theory that the Mossad had taken him out because he had displeased them. That was one of the theories around his death. And she seemed convinced that he had been killed.
That's right. Robert Maxwell wasn't just rumoured to be an informant for Britain and Russia. He was also suspected to be an informant for Israel. Here's biographer Martin Dillon again.
Maxwell did a lot of business with the KGB. He did a lot of business with organized crime syndicates. He did a lot of business with Mossad, particularly beginning in the early 1980s until his death in 1991. He also did business with British intelligence, though he didn't agree to work for them full time. So whatever was in his interests, that's what mattered to him.
Mossad, of course, is the Israeli intelligence agency, like their CIA. Here's Tom Bauer.
Maxwell had very, very close relations with Israel the last 3-4 years of his life because he felt very, very close to Israel because of his own Orthodox Jewish background and because he was a very good link between the Israelis and the Russians. And also he bought 2 very, very good investments in Israel from which he made a lot of money.
So you need to remember the context in which Maxwell was making all of these connections. It was in the context of the Iran-Iraq War. If you don't remember that war of the early 1980s, it's a bit of a mind trick, because while Iran is fighting Iraq, countries who would otherwise be enemies, such as Israel and Iran, are quietly doing business with one another. That is, Israel is supplying Iran with weapons. Meanwhile, the Soviets are covertly sending weapons to Iran. But at the same time, they're openly supplying Iraq. So here's Maxwell, close to both the Soviet Union and Israel. The perfect conduit, allegedly, who moves Iranian money without anybody knowing. People close to him, however, deny that he did this. Moreover, it's extremely difficult to confirm that Maxwell was directly involved as an Israeli and Russian asset. But former Mossad agent Viktor Ostrovsky likens Maxwell's role for the Israelis as the equivalent of being a Russian sleeper, somebody whose business and political contacts were a very useful way to pass on information and money. A Mr. Ari Ben-Menashe, former Israeli military intelligence officer.
That's how I got to know Maxwell. I was part of the team that was exporting arms to the Iranians during their war against Iraq.
So the way it supposedly worked was this. The Iranians would send funds to Bahrain, who in turn paid Maxwell, who then paid Israel. All of this has subsequently been reported in news outlets, except for the intimate role that Robert Maxwell allegedly played. Now, this alleged role, according to Ben-Menashe, was that Maxwell was the middleman, moving payments for arms around in the Iran-Iraq war and also involving the Eastern Bloc.
A lot of it was bought from the Soviet Union at the time, and we were sending it to the Iranians, and the Iranians would pay through Maxwell, paid the Israelis through Robert Maxwell.
It was within this context that Jeffrey was allegedly brought under Israel's influence. Ben-Menashe says that he knows about Maxwell's dealings in the 1980s because Ben-Menashe was also involved in arms dealing for the Israelis in this period. Ben-Menashe's name captured headlines in 1989 when he was caught in the US, trying to broker a sale of US military aircraft to Iran on behalf of Israel. He was charged with violating the US Arms Control Export Act, and he spent a year in a US jail before the case went to trial. His defense argued that he was working for the Israeli government, and the US jury believed that. He was acquitted. He has said that he was intimately involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. Over the years, the Israeli government has distanced themselves from Ben-Menashe. He eventually landed in Canada and founded a so-called consulting business. Now, this has caught media attention for representing a series of authoritarian and anti-democratic figures. For example, former Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe. Ben-Menashe has also worked for military juntas, like the regime in Myanmar. And as you'll hear later, US intelligence views him as currently representing Israeli state interests in certain countries abroad. He has denied working for the Israelis currently. So back to Robert Maxwell's dealings with the Soviets, the Iranians, and the Israelis in the 1980s. It's into this world that Jeffrey Epstein allegedly steps. Jeffrey would be brought in to help Israel's national security efforts. The help went far beyond the kind of back-channel diplomacy and money moving that Maxwell had allegedly done for the Israelis. Several of my sources say that Jeffrey used blackmail to promote Israel's interests as part of a massive influence campaign on the United States. Why? Because Jeffrey had become an arms dealer and a money launderer in the Middle East and elsewhere, according to sources. So here's another little piece of history that you need to know in order to understand how Jeffrey got here. While the Iran-Iraq war raged in the early 1980s, the biggest arms deal ever was going down between the British and the Saudis. El Yamama. It's now infamous for how corrupt it was. Jeffrey was working with two men reported to be critically involved with the behind-the-scenes deal-makers of El Yamama. One, allegedly, was a British defence contractor, Douglas Lease. The other was the Saudi businessman Adnan Khashoggi. Khashoggi was Saudi Arabia's lead arms dealer in the 1970s and 80s, and that helped him build staggering wealth, which in turn funded a headline-grabbing and wildly ostentatious lifestyle. but also investigations into his shady business deals, like being Oliver North's arms broker in the Iran-Contra scandal. Now, both Lise and Khashoggi knew Robert Maxwell, as did Jeffrey, according to several sources. They all three met in the early 1980s. According to a very close friend of Khashoggi's and of Jeffrey's, the Syrian banker Amer Pasha, Maxwell had met Khashoggi through Jeffrey, and they'd become close.
I mean, I don't know how it came about, but it happened on the occasion where he mentioned it was Maxwell that introduced him to Jeffrey. Sometimes even it happened with other people around, but I can't remember who.
Separately, Jeffrey told a business colleague in the 1980s, Stephen Hoffenberg, that Jeffrey was advising Maxwell on his businesses, specifically restructuring debt. He went to prison for 18 years for bilking investors out of almost $500 million in a giant Ponzi scheme. But much of what he's told me over the past 20 years has checked out.
Robert Maxwell was in a financial bind and needed to restructure his debt and obligations with a plan of reorganization. Jeffrey Epstein advised Robert Maxwell on how to reposition his debt, the money he owed, in order to get out of the financial bind he was stuck in at that time. And Jeffrey Epstein was starting to advise Robert Maxwell on his different options of how to reorganize his funding of money around the world.
Maxwell liked Jeffrey, both Ben Menashe and Hoffenberg say. And according to them, in the late 1980s, Maxwell introduced Jeffrey to some of his Israeli network. Now, Ben Menashe claims to have been present for this.
I know that Robert Maxwell took him to Israel. Yes, I was there.
So why did Robert Maxwell bring Jeffrey Epstein to Israel to recruit him?
He didn't know what to do with him. He wanted to get him a job. In my view, it's just a guess. I don't have direct knowledge of it. He didn't want him working in his office or with him. He wanted to send him off somewhere else.
Ben Menashe says that the Israelis were divided about whether Jeffrey should be used as some sort of intelligence asset. Personally, he was against it. He couldn't see the point of Jeffrey. He thought he was reckless, dangerous, bad for Israel's reputation.
He just didn't want to have anything to do with him, but Maxwell took him to Israel, and another group of Israeli intelligence people picked him up exactly for the reasons that why we didn't want to have anything to do with him.
In other words, they picked him up because he was a con artist and a thief.
Correct. So please, Jeffrey, I'm sorry for the words, but have fucked the dog if he had to.
And there was more. Jeffrey told Steve Hoffenberg that what the Israelis wanted was far more than just off-the-record arms dealing and money laundering. They wanted him to gain access to powerful Americans who could help Israel. They were aware that he might use any means necessary to gain leverage and information, including blackmail. Well, we come back to this allegation then of the influence campaign. They were trying to blackmail politicians, powerful people. Is that what you're talking about?
That's only one component. Blackmail. Influence trading, information trading.
Right.
At the level we're discussing by these three men is very serious and dangerous.
Ben Menashe claims that the pressure to exert an influence campaign in America intensified when Bill Clinton was to become president in 1993. According to Ben Menashe, the Israelis were extremely nervous that the US would turn pro-Palestinian.
Looking for influence with the American president? Who isn't?
Ostrovsky says that the Israelis often work with civilians to influence powerful people.
There's a name for that today, which is called perception makers.
Perception makers.
Yeah, it's like you have a PR firm.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a PM firm. It's a perception maker, because what you say is, okay, if I tell you the Russians are bad, and I can bring things that made it happen, that that they're responsible for A, B, C, and D, I can create the perception, whether it's true or not, of something being real.
The achievement at the end of it is that I feel that my life, which I'm continuing to live to the full, and will do so until the day I die, I will have left the world a slightly better place by having lived in it and have influenced a few things and people in the right direction, rather as if it hadn't mattered whether I was born, lived, or died.
Maxwell was given a hero's funeral in Jerusalem, where he's buried on the Mount of Olives. But within just days of his death, a shocking crime came to light. Here's Martin Dillon.
Maxwell has stolen the pension funds of the Daily Mirror newspaper. Pension funds of 25,000 people. He was going down, and he was going down in a big way.
Maxwell had stolen hundreds of millions of pounds from his own newspaper's pension fund, and the police knew about it. Victor Ostrovsky alleges that Maxwell had asked the Mossad for financial help. When they refused, things got ugly. Ostrovsky left the Mossad several years before this happened.
He didn't understand that you do not threaten the Mossad. I mean, you can do a lot of other things, but do not threaten them, because they take that very seriously. So when a threat is made, it basically cuts all the history or good history that was there and valuable and whatever, and it's all gone through the window.
So do you think Robert Maxwell was killed by the Mossad?
I think so, yeah.
So that's one possible theory as to why Maxwell may have been murdered. Here's Ari Ben-Menashe.
I believe that Robert Maxwell had to be gotten rid of because he was about to be arrested by the British police, and he would have had to go on trial and go through details that the Israelis and others did not want to be made public.
It wasn't just his narcissism any longer.
Martin Dillon, again.
He was becoming very, very uncontrollable. And I think that Mossad knew that the end had come. And it's not as if Israel hasn't, in the past decided that someone has to go.
"1991 was a big year for Jeffrey, as we've learned. It's the year Robert Maxwell dies. It's the year the Southern District of New York expanded their investigation of Towers Financial. It's the year he allegedly began helping Israeli intelligence with an influence campaign. And it's also the year that Jeffrey was given a lot of power in a relationship with somebody else. This person was even more central to his mysterious fortune than Ghislaine was. This person was Leslie Wexner, the self-made retail billionaire, the founder of L Brands, including Victoria's Secret, the lingerie company. Les Wexner is considered a serious, reclusive, self-made multi-billionaire who doesn't tolerate fools. He's based in Columbus, Ohio, which is the headquarters of his business.
He's cited as one of the most important and influential businessmen here in Central Ohio, but over the past few months, L Brand founder Les Wexner's accomplishments have been mere footnotes as we continue to learn more about his connection with convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein.
Wexner has said that he didn't see through Jeffrey, despite many warnings. So how could Wexner have missed Jeffrey's con artistry? Wexner wasn't the sort of man who had many close friends. But when Jeffrey came along, something strange apparently happened. Wexner gave Jeffrey control over his fortune and had him live literally next door. How did this happen?
Les Wexner is a titan.
Bob Vitrakis is a local activist and editor-in-chief for the Columbus Free Press, a progressive publication in Ohio. Vitrakis has done decades of investigative reporting, including about Les Wexner.
The only billionaire in central Ohio. He has more buildings than the next 10 people combined. His name is everywhere. It's the OSU Wexner Center, the hospital in town. It's on the East Time, everywhere. You can't come to Columbus, Ohio without seeing his name. Not only did he put a lot of money into politics and give money away, $65 million or so, to OSU's medical center to have it renamed. The arts community, the nonprofit community, he through the Columbus Foundation, he poured in a ton of money.
Wexner's influence in Ohio was so great that it felt to some people like he owned it, multiple sources told me. According to someone he confided in, his focus was on the limited, and he didn't want to be bothered with managing his family office. But he did want his family office managed better, and not by the old guard. Enter Jeffrey. In 1991, Wexner gave Jeffrey power of attorney over everything except for the limited. It was an extraordinary thing to do. A source told me recently that even the lawyers who drafted the agreement could just not understand why Wexner was doing it, and they expressed their concern.
Well, Epstein's name really started coming out around 1991, the year he gets the durable power of attorney to move all of Wexner's billions. So at that point, it's at a certain level in the city, people are gossiping. And the question is, what's their relationship? And then, I asked people that were very well connected in this town, some that worked at the Limited, and many of them said, he's this enigma. I mean, he's thought to have some ties, to intelligence. He's thought to be an asset to very important people. I would watch what you do to offend him. And, I was quite stunned by that.
Wexner kept Jeffrey around to manage not just his money, but every aspect of his personal life. His vast yacht, his furniture, his art collection. Regardless of this report. Regardless, actually, of all the negative talk about Jeffrey. And there was plenty of that. And here's yet another thing that Jeffrey reportedly did while spending time in central Ohio, Wexner's home base. Remember local journalist Bob Vitrakis? Well, Bob Vitrakis has a theory about all of this. We don't have the facts to prove it true or false. But back in 2002, Bob told me that Jeffrey even got a cargo airline called Southern Air Transport to move its headquarters to Columbus, Ohio, out of Miami. Now, this was helpful to Wexner because it would mean multiple direct flights each week between Ohio and Hong Kong to transport cargo for the Limited. Seems simple enough. Except nothing is simple with Jeffrey.
Southern Air Transport, which was the most notorious gun-running airline in the world at a time when I was following that. Mr. Epstein was in charge of the logistics of helping to move it here for Mr. Wexner. I mean, this is the former Air America drug and gun-running airline covert operations. I mean, this was a CIA proprietary affront, and it ran guns and arms.
Alan Dershowitz says that Jeffrey could make problems go away, thus avoiding public litigation. Alan told me a story that Jeffrey had told him about Wexner's airplane. This was in the 1990s. Alan says that Jeffrey claimed to him that Wexner's plane was boarded when he landed at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, and that contraband was allegedly found. And according to Jeffrey, there was a big possibility that the plane could be confiscated.
And they found him with tens of thousands of dollars worth of Cuban cigars that he was trying to smuggle into the country. They also found, according to Epstein, $50,000 in cash, also illegally.
Jeffrey phoned Dershowitz to see if he could help. But Jeffrey told Dershowitz that he couldn't. He didn't have any connections to help with customs. And frankly, he didn't see any way round the problem. Yet somehow, miraculously apparently, Jeffrey told Dershowitz a few days later that he'd made the problem go away, quietly.
Jeffrey Epstein settled that case politically for him without involving lawyers, and other cases were settled as well.
So how did Jeffrey get this to just go away? Alan doesn't know. One source told me that Jeffrey was close with many US customs officials. It's a pretty significant question, because years later it emerged that Jeffrey had avoided very serious federal charges and instead got a cushy sentence on state charges around something called a non-prosecution agreement. Now this made everyone wonder, what exactly was his clout with the law in this country? In hindsight, it looks like he had quite a lot. In 2019, I reported for the Daily Beast that senior government officials were told that Jeffrey had, quote, belonged to intelligence, hence his cushy deal. Vanessa Neumann is a former national security and terrorist analyst for the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And in your experience, does it happen in America? Can the American Department of Justice be influenced by our intelligence networks?
Sure. I mean, the official line is no, right? I mean, the official line is DOJ is supposed to be 100%, independent. It tracks, it follows its own line, its own criminality. But absolutely, of course, that you do have sometimes conversations about please hold back or try and accelerate it. You see that the whole time.
So Wexner was one of America's biggest donors to Israel, and Jeffrey introduced him to like-minded thinkers, including prominent academics and politicians. And the stated mission of Wexner's foundation, if you look at it online, includes strengthening leadership in the North American Jewish community and the State of Israel. So this is all in the early 1990s. Bill Clinton becomes president. And as I'm writing this, a photograph I'd heard about has finally shown up in the media. It's of Bill Clinton showing Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell around the White House in 1993. Reportedly, this was a VIP visit because Jeffrey had donated money to have the Oval Office refurbished. Now, up until that point, he didn't have much money. That's what you call access. Ben Menashe says that there's no coincidence to the timing of any of this. He says that the whole point for the Israelis of hiring Jeffrey was to influence the incoming administration's policy on Israel.
It goes back to 1992 when Bill Clinton was elected president. The Israelis were terrified that they had another Carter. Another Jimmy Carter that would force them into a peace deal that they did not want. So they sent good old Jeffrey after Bill Clinton.
I know this sounds far-fetched, but Steve Hoffenberg, on a bad phone line, backs him up, based, he says, on what Jeffrey told him. So, do you think Jeffrey targeted Les Wexner as part of this Israeli influence campaign?
Without a question, Jeffrey desperately wanted the relationship with Leslie Wexner. That was a critical turning point for Jeffrey. And Ghislaine was very helpful with that opportunity for Jeffrey because she was very popular, very, very popular. And she was a big asset to Jeffrey. So it all came together very well for Ghislaine and Jeffrey. at that time frame. It was a tragedy of the death. It was a sad circumstance for the Maxwell family. But Jeffrey was entrenched in the family affairs and did an awful lot in support of the tragedy, the death of Robert Maxwell, for the Maxwell family.
Ben Menashe also says, along with Hoffenberg, that the whole idea of befriending Wexner originated with Robert Maxwell. The idea was to gather information and pass it along.
Jeffrey Epstein was mentored substantially by Robert Maxwell on how to deal with national security. And what you're linking together is how Jeffrey Epstein applied his national security training to the three countries, to the UK, to Israel, to the United States, and how it benefited Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell substantially. That's the linkage, and that's the mystery.
When Hoffenberg is talking about, quote, national security, he's not talking about spying. Instead, he's talking about business and social relationships between high-powered international players that can sometimes become enmeshed in politics.
Then when Daddy died, she was left with no choice. So she moved on and teamed up with him.
So in terms of influence, Ghislaine could introduce Jeffrey to glittering individuals like Prince Andrew, as well as other foreign royals and dignitaries. But Les Wexner gave Jeffrey a route into some of the most important institutions in America. After 2010, Jeffrey boasted that he was extremely active internationally. Vanessa Neumann explains how he could have operated, at least theoretically.
So people like that, like an Epstein, is something what we would call sort of a hyperconnector.
Sources I've spoken to all over the world refer to Jeffrey, particularly in the last decade, as a fixer. Someone who could do, quote, invisible deals for people. But Jeffrey was allegedly an unusual sort of fixer, because he worked in all sorts of countries and he intersected between different global networks. My sources tell me that he talked openly of how he was a link between Africa, the Middle East, Israel, and the United States. So how did this work? So I have one source who is close to the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. This person explained Jeffrey's relationships in that region this way. Israel's allies became Jeffrey's business associates. To give an example, back in 2015, the United States, among other countries, entered into a nuclear deal with Iran. In reaction, Sunni powers, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, moved closer to the Israelis against the Shiite-controlled Iran. So the Saudis and the Emiratis were both looking for deals in the United States and Israel. Jeffrey, according to my source, was just the guy to help. According to this person, Jeffrey made introductions for MBS and other Arab businessmen to US and Israeli hedge fund managers, who ordinarily they would not have approached cold. Plus, according to my source, Jeffrey provided the Saudis with intelligence as to what the latest Israeli thinking was geopolitically. Now, this is not classified intelligence, just general insight. A second source told me that he had received a phone call from a very senior Middle East politician asking to be connected to Jeffrey. Here's Vanessa.
Because he is not only very deeply connected in one network, right? He connects different networks. And not that many people can do that and move back and forth that easily. So it's not just like he was, the American Jewish business network. He also had, the Middle East, and he could link banking to royalty, etc. And he could move back and forth through those groups, which means that he's very key to anybody who wants to either move money or make things happen. And it would also be valuable to the other people you would sort of attract would either be transnational crime, transnational organized crimes. And the other thing that you would attract is also sort of, because of that, the intelligence services, right? So you sort of sit in the middle of connecting the different networks, and that's very hard to replace. And they sort of gather around people who either have certain skills, which is a facilitator. Someone like an Epstein would also have this facility to link different networks. What that means is also that he's protected or would be protected by various people. When you have that kind of reach and that kind of connectivity, you have a lot of people who have a vested interest in protecting you or keeping you in power. You know, depending on what the deal is, he could be making money off that. He can be a proxy, a straw man, which you also, you know, take a fee for. So all those kinds of things, and that would be pretty normal. And when you have that kind of connectivity, it means you're doing it for a number of people. And it also means that you're also helping people have conversations without them being seen to be speaking to each other, right? So if the Saudis wanted to talk to the Israelis, sometimes they would have their own quiet conversation, or sometimes you would just send someone else, send an envoy who is from neither side. And then that way you can sort of push the negotiation forward without anybody realizing that these two sides are speaking. So that's the invisible man role.
Another place ripe for meddling by an invisible man hyperfixer was Africa. Some of these cash-strapped African countries are desperate for financial help to build infrastructure and to grow their economies. But their, quote, weak state status makes them vulnerable to illicit gun, drug, and human trafficking cartels. There's been a long-standing turf war in the arms business in the region between the Israelis on one hand and the Iranians and Hezbollah on the other. And according to American experts, one of the best-known lobbyists in the region is, somewhat ironically, given his earlier alleged connection to Robert Maxwell, Ari Ben Menashe. According to public records and to American and African intelligence sources, Ben Menashe is or has been the registered lobbyist for various strongmen and African regimes, including in Zimbabwe, Libya, Congo-Brazzaville, and the Ivory Coast. Here's an African intelligence expert who's worked in the region for 30 years. To protect his identity, we're calling him Joe, and we're altering his voice.
Ari Ben Menashe, and again, there's a bunch of Israelis doing their thing all over Africa, as is Chinese and Russians. But Ari Ben Menashe, and specifically through his companies, have been lobbying, which I would call, and I might be wrong, nefarious or less than favorable individuals. There is business in Africa, and whether you decide to touch it or not, that is up to you. And somebody like Ari Ben Menashe is very open to lobbying and working on behalf of the less favorable individuals, you know, Libya, Sudan, Yemen, all of these sort of places. So he's featured prominently.
Separate from this, Ben Menashe is also the registered lobbyist for DP World, a maritime business with a deep reach in Africa. DP World's CEO is Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem. Now, bin Sulayem is somebody that Jeffrey bragged about knowing and doing business with, at least to Ed Epstein. Bin Sulayem and DP World have not been accused of doing anything criminal, but Jeffrey may have wanted to use them to get access for himself to do illegal deals. When Jeffrey bought his second island in the Caribbean, the name on the shell company that purchased it was Bin Sulayem's. Now it's been reported that Bin Sulayem told Jeffrey not to use his name on the paperwork for the island purchase, particularly after the seller refused to have anything to do with a convicted sex offender. But Jeffrey went ahead without Bin Sulayem's knowledge. Still, the paperwork is an indicator that there was some sort of relationship. In one of their tea meetings in the past decade, Jeffrey told the journalist Ed Epstein all about his relationship with bin Sulayem and stressed how important it was for him financially in Africa.
He basically said he showed people, he advised people in ways to invest in these people. Well, the dictator from Djibouti, who had one of the largest tax-free, custom-free port zones he ran.
Ed's talking about the port of Djibouti, one of the busiest and most strategically important deep-water cargo ports in the world. Until 2018, bin Sulayem's company controlled the Durala container terminal in Djibouti. The Djibouti government seized it in February of that year over a long-running dispute, and that dealt the company a major financial blow. Jeffrey told Ed that he was very close with bin Sulayem and that they worked tightly together. He even wanted Ed to meet him and other African clients. Ed never did. So, Djibouti. In case you're not up on your geography, it lies on the Horn of Africa, part of East Africa. It's a stone's throw away from Yemen and Somalia, two terrorist hotbeds, and it's near a major oil shipping choke point, feeding Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Here's Gretchen Peters, the executive director of the Center on Illicit Networks and Transnational Organized Crime.
Speaking more broadly, one of the things that we have seen is that a variety of foreign actors and criminal organizations have vied for control of or influence over ports up and down Africa's coasts.
It's the perfect spot from which to move weapons around the globe.
It's literally a smuggler's paradise. These long open coastlines and a variety of deep water ports that boats can be brought into.
Meanwhile, she says, the authorities who are supposed to be monitoring and controlling criminal activity are overworked and under-resourced, and highly corrupt.
There's tremendous opportunities to pay off even high-level officials in various countries. One of the patterns we've seen across Africa is it is very, very easy to move goods illicitly in and out of the continent, and therefore it becomes a transit point.
The port of Djibouti is also a place that smugglers and traffickers use to disguise the origins of goods. Weapons, drugs, wildlife, you name it, get shipped there and are then repackaged and relabeled and shipped out again.
For example, we've seen ivory shipments trafficked really far away from where elephants exist and then repackaged in a different port and then shipped out so that when that container arrives in the destination port, say if it's ivory, it's probably Hong Kong or somewhere in China or Vietnam, nobody will suspect there's ivory inside because it's come from a place where that doesn't exist. So if you're trying to move weapons around and you want to smuggle them through Djibouti, it's not a place that has a big weapons industry. So it's a perfect place to move things in, repackage it, send it out again.
And the amount of money to be made from the port of Djibouti is infinite. That's according to Joe. He's speaking hypothetically here about Jeffrey's claim to Ed Epstein of having a close relationship with Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem from Dubai.
The port of Djibouti is a very, very important port for Africa. And if you control that individual that controls the port, you can make a fortune. And especially if you have some sort of hold over that individual, your price could be anything.
But Jeffrey's alleged influence in Africa was not limited to Djibouti. He was also close, according to a report from Africa Intelligence, with the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea. Okay, so you may never have heard of Equatorial Guinea. Well, it's a very tiny but extremely oil-rich country on the west coast of Africa. It also happens to have one of the worst track records for human rights in Africa, at least according to the United Nations. It's a country run by an autocratic president, Teodoro Obiang, who's been reported on as being bribable and corrupt. Joe, my African intelligence specialist, says that it's known in his circles that Jeffrey and Teodoro's son, Teodorin, were trying to make some kind of business deal. Teodorin Obiang, the son, by the way, is a fairly colourful character. He's 52, and he has extremely expensive tastes. He's also been charged and convicted of money laundering by the French Justice Department. The matter has since been settled out of court. The Brazilian Department of Justice has ongoing investigations into his activities there, and in 2017 he paid a visit to Las Vegas in which one of his entourage died. According to Joe and 2 other sources, the intelligence world knows that Teodorin and Jeffrey used to meet in Jeffrey's home in Paris. A lawyer for Teodorin has denied this to Africa Intelligence magazine. What's unclear, however, is how successful these attempted business efforts were. What is known by a couple of intelligence sources is that Teodorin's father refused to deal with Jeffrey, and that Jeffrey created a rift in the first family. I asked a source of mine who covers Equatorial Guinea if Jeffrey had likely made money from the association. The reply: if he didn't, he'd be the first person not to make money out of such a relationship. So to sum up, the Africans weren't his only source of business. Jeffrey had many networks, and unusually for a hyperfixer, he was brazen about them. My sources say that his long-standing relationship to the Israelis was still intact all the while. One source from the Middle East whom I quoted earlier said Jeffrey was special. Not only was his alleged relationship with the Israelis watertight, but traditional adversaries of Israel, the Saudis and the Emiratis, now trusted him as a go-between. They could have used any number of conduits, but perhaps what set Jeffrey apart, and apologies in advance for saying this, but it is what my source, who's from that part of the world, said. Don't forget the importance of the punani. That means pussy. In other words, Jeffrey provided them with women.
I'm supposing that when he was first arrested in 2008, some people helped him out of trouble. Yes? Powerful people, probably in Israel, yes, helped him. But when he got rearrested, somebody wanted to get rid of him. They were getting too scared of what he may know and what he may make public, especially after he was sued by these young ladies. They were afraid of what may be exposed in these trials. I'm suggesting that Epstein needed to be gotten rid of somehow, one way or the other.
He's suggesting that the Israelis may have given up on Jeffrey. He suggested the same thing about the death of Robert Maxwell. History has shown that no country likes it when their intelligence assets become too high profile, in a bad way.